When the Sister of Shadows disappeared into the depths of the darkness, the convent seemed to exhale, the heavy air lifting just slightly, as though the very building had been holding its breath. Isabella stood in the aftermath, her body trembling, her chest heaving as she clutched the lantern. The shadows that had chased her, whispered in her ears, had receded, but they left behind a lingering chill. She was no longer sure what was real and what was imagined. Her heart still pounded in her chest as she stared at the empty space where the sister had been. But something had changed. The air felt different now, as though the convent itself had shifted. The walls seemed closer, the floors more uneven beneath her feet. It was as if the very structure of the place had been a trap all along, and for a moment, she feared that she was still ensnared within it. The darkness had come so close, so tangible, she could feel its cold breath on her skin. She ran, stumbled, through the hallways, her legs unsteady beneath her as she clung to the lantern. The cold that had gripped her soul had not released its hold, it felt as if it had sunk into her very bones. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, of fear, of fragments of memories that didn't belong to her. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this, how much longer she could bear the weight of the convent's curse. Isabella found herself drawn back to the chapel, the place where the sister had first confronted her. She didn't know why. She was supposed to be running away, fleeing this cursed place, but something deep inside her, something rooted in the very marrow of her soul, pulled her back. The doors of the chapel swung open before her, and she stepped inside, her breath fogging in the air. The once imposing space now seemed smaller, its high ceilings low and suffocating. The cold was sharper here, the shadows longer, stretching across the walls like creeping tendrils. Isabella hesitated at the altar. The crucifix she had seen earlier, the one she had used to pray, was still there, its wood darkened and worn by time, but the figure of Christ hung lifeless, the pain in his eyes colder than ever. The walls of the chapel were lined with faded frescoes, depictions of angels and saints, their faces eroded by centuries of neglect. Yet in the dim light, there was something else hidden beneath the layers of dust, a pattern of something ancient. She stepped closer to one of the walls, squinting. The faded images of saints seemed to be converging on a single point, their eyes fixed on a shadowy figure that appeared more monstrous than holy. It was hard to tell what it was, the lines too blurred and the colors too dark to make out, but it felt like an accusation. Like the face of something that had once lived here, something that had been buried in the walls, in the bones of the convent. A voice echoed in her mind, the sister's voice, cold and distant. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, without warning, the air in the chapel shifted once more, and the walls seemed to tremble, as though they were waking from some long-forgotten slumber. Isabella's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel something dark beneath her feet, a pulse, like the heartbeat of the building itself. She turned, suddenly aware of the oppressive weight of the shadows behind her. The air was thick, suffocating, like the silent scream of the earth, and she heard something move, something slithering and scraping across the stone floor. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, coiling around the altar, curling toward her like a snake ready to strike. Isabella's skin prickled with cold fear, and she instinctively backed away. She wanted to run, to flee as she had before, but her legs were heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what she was beginning to understand. The Sister of Shadows was not the first. There had been others before her, others who had come here, drawn to this place by forces beyond their understanding. In the flickering light of the lantern, Isabella caught sight of something buried beneath the dust and shadows. A journal, an old leather-bound book lying half-hidden under the altar. It was small, almost forgotten, its pages yellowed with age. Trembling, she picked it up, the weight of it almost unbearable. She could feel the cold of the parchment seep into her fingers as she opened it. The pages were written in a language she didn't recognize, a script twisted and unfamiliar, though some parts were legible, names, dates, fragments of prayers. But there was something else too. Drawings. Strange symbols and images, some of which she recognized from the faded frescoes on the walls. One drawing in particular caught her eye. It was crude, almost childlike, but the image was unmistakable, a woman in a habit, her face obscured by a veil. But behind her, within the shadows, was a figure. No, not a figure. It was something else, a shape too dark, too formless to be a person, its eyes glowing with a hunger that sent a cold shiver down Isabella's spine. She turned the pages frantically, her hands shaking, searching for answers, for any clue that might explain what she was seeing. There were accounts, written by nuns who had lived here before, accounts of strange happenings, of voices in the walls, of a woman who had never aged, who had lived for centuries. The convent had been built atop an ancient site, long before Christianity had ever reached this land. It was a place where shadows held sway, where something had been sealed away, buried in the earth below the chapel. The nuns who had come here had been drawn by something in the land, something that called to them in the night, that twisted their prayers and turned their faith to madness. And in one entry, a single name stood out. Sister Verena. The same name that had been whispered to her by the Sister of Shadows. It was the name of a nun who had vanished, decades ago, under strange and terrifying circumstances. The journal hinted at dark rituals, at ancient pacts made long before the convent had been consecrated. Sister Verena had been the one to unlock the curse, to invite the shadow that had been waiting beneath the convent to rise. She had made herself a vessel for something dark, something eternal, and in doing so, had condemned all who followed her. The Sister of Shadows was not just a haunting. She was the guardian of the curse, the manifestation of the darkness that had been sealed in the convent's walls, waiting for someone, anyone, to come and release it. Isabella's hands trembled as she closed the book. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe. The shadows were closing in again. The walls seemed to bend and warp, stretching toward her like gaping mouths. She had to leave. There was no other choice. She had to escape this place before it consumed her. But as she moved to the door, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. A breath of air, freezing and foul, passed over her skin. She turned, slowly, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was the Sister of Shadows once more. This time, her face was not masked in mystery. This time, her face was bare, her skin pale and taut, her eyes black as the deepest abyss. Her lips moved, but no sound came from them. The shadows gathered around her, swirling, darkening the room. "Leave, or become one of us," the sister's voice rasped. It was not a threat. It was a plea. Isabella felt herself being drawn toward the dark figure, her limbs moving of their own accord. Her mind screamed at her to run, to resist, but it was as though the walls themselves were bending her will, pulling her closer to the sister. She couldn't fight it. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was the crucifix on the wall, its eyes watching her, its lips sealed in silence. She had come here seeking redemption. Now, she would be another forgotten soul buried in the shadows of the convent. Epilogue. Days later, the villagers spoke of the convent once more. Some said the skies had grown darker, the earth colder. Others spoke in hushed tones of a nun who had entered the cursed place and never returned. But the convent itself remained as it always had, silent, still, and waiting. And deep within its walls, the Sister of Shadows waited too.